Hello, and welcome to TA Intel, a podcast about the business of small business support. Each episode of TA Intel offers insights on leadership and professional development for the people who run and deliver services in entrepreneurial support organizations. I'm your host, Christian Conroy. I have over 30 years of experience in organizations that enable small businesses to start, grow, survive, and thrive. I provide leadership and strategic support to economic development and educational organizations across the country. Joining me today is Shawn Thompson. Shawn has 20 years of nonprofit leadership experience and specializes in streamlining grant compliance processes for mission driven organizations nationwide. In this episode, we will be talking about match, those funds that are requirements to obtain federal grant awards. This is the first of three episodes that we are doing on match. In this one, we will dive into the basics of what is match, how to use match to acquire federal funds, and tips on how to manage match. But before we dive into this conversation, Shawn, why don't you take a moment and share a little bit more about your background?
Hi, thank you, Christian. And yes, I'm Shawn Thompson. And recently I've been doing consulting with several small business development centers around the country, and also have a background as an associate state director for two of California's states or regions. California and Texas are larger geographically and per population, so they're divided up differently. But I've worked for two of those, and then also implemented and led the National Association of Small Business Development Center financial trainings, and was a mentor for multiple financial leaders across the country. My background included supervising 18 subrecipients across Northern California, as well as implementing a VBOC, Apex, and familiarity with WBC programs as well.
Yeah, no, I mean that's just the experience that we want to that can be valuable, I think, to folks in terms of this topic, which is, what match. It's kind of a arcane subject, but it is kind of important if you're going to be managing some of the different types of programs that you just talked about, which are based on federal funding. So just to get us started, maybe some definitions. What is match? What is cash match? And other sources of match? We hear all these different terms that are out there. So maybe if you can just talk a little bit about, what are the different types of match and what do they mean? How are they defined?
Yeah. And no, takes a lot, and sometimes it takes years for people to figure out, honestly. But I mean, I think the easiest way to explain it is you have a budget slash a pie, and if you have a piece of the pie that's federal money, then you need to have 50% of the pie that is cost match, and that cost match can be divided up into different flavors. But basically, if you have a federal award like SBDC, then it requires a 50% match. If you have, Apex, it can be different percentages. WBC, it can be different percentages. But basically, you have a pie, and then what is adding to those different parts of it. So, depending on what your match is, that's going to be anything, your match requirement. It's going to be anything that is not federal dollars. And so just the cost match, or let's just say cash, it needs to not be funneled through federal agencies. So one of the things that gets people confused is, as I was talking to someone recently, is Treasury money. Even if it comes through a different agency, or in California, Caltrans money, it's Department of Transportation money, or Department of Defense money. These things that it's like, oh, but the county's giving it to me, or ARA funding that happened recently. You need to kind of trace it back of where did the county, where did that organization get the money from? Because if it comes from a federal source, then that can't be counted. So that's the cash part of it. And then, but ones that are allowable would be the county, if it is, public funds that are raised locally. If you want to talk to banks about they have money that they need to invest in their local communities. If there's private areas that want to contribute to helping with training costs, your university, your host, those types of things, those are allowable. And In kind is another one that's it's anything that's you didn't pay money for. So it's something that if someone volunteers who's an attorney to do a training about international property or intellectual property, and they normally get paid $1,000 an hour. Well, okay, you could have them write up something saying I volunteered my time that was $1,000 an hour. But really, if you wouldn't pay an advisor normally $1,000, then that would not be realistic because we could all go find, someone who makes bazillions of dollars and have them do trainings. But if you wouldn't truly pay for that yourself, then that needs to be marked down to whatever your hourly rate is that you normally pay people. So that gets people kind of confused a lot of times. But things that can be donated are professional services, equipment, office space. Those are kind of common ones. Um, and even food or things like that for certain types of trainings or events. Indirect and waived indirect. Ooh, this is where when you do your budget for your grant, there's going to be a spot at the end. So just for easy math, let's say you're applying for $100,000. So then if you decide that you're going to ask for 20%, and so then you can have
20%
20%
indirect, you mean here, right?
indirect, yeah,
Okay.
cash indirect. And so like some programs allow you to have 20% cash indirect, that's the maximum. So you can add that in. That's going to mean you're going to have $80,000 in this example as money that are going to be expenses that are going to be reimbursed. But you're going to have $20,000 that will be part of your overhead. It's F&A that can go usually to your host. And it's just to accommodate for the fact that there's all of this management of doing the budgets, usually for the host, submitting the proposals. There's staff that have payroll that needs to get processed, all these things that are not in the budget. Like we don't usually have the janitors and the light bill and things like that that are like itemized in the budget. It's to cover whatever costs are not itemized in the categories of the budget, basically. And then if there is the waived indirect, that would be if I work at a university and they have a negotiated cognizant agreement of 50%, that they're allowed to take 50% off of the top of a grant. So if you got $100,000, then they would keep 50,000 and then there'd be 50,000 for direct costs. But if they don't take that 50% in this example, they only take 20%, then that's 30% that can be waived indirect. And so then that can count towards the big umbrella of cost match. And you need to have, I mean, in the program I worked for mostly for small business development, it had to have 50% cash at a minimum, and 50% could be the waived and in kind, which are donated amounts that don't have like dollar signs directly attached to them for audit purposes, I guess. I know that's a mouthful.
Oh, yeah, no, it's like as even though it's, we're trying to set the stage with, setting these terms, it does demonstrate, I think, very quickly just, how complicated this, topic and subject matter really are. And that's why, as I said at the beginning, we're actually gonna be breaking this into, 3 different episodes, and we're gonna get into a little bit more detail about, how do you exactly calculate things like your indirect and waived indirect, and how do you use that, and what are some strategies for how you put together a budget. So a lot more detail to come if this is grabbing you right off the go. So when we get federal funds, and then you've got these additional dollars that we're calling match now, or that are match, then that combination, if my understanding is, that's called program funds, right? And then so talk about, are there standards about what's allowable for match that we should know about?
Yeah, no, and then that's a great question too. And I mean, and just kind of going back to the first part of this, people need to hear it so many times. And I mean, I can even get a little bit like bungled up and confused about it sometimes. That there's so many different flavors and scenarios. Yeah, just even if you don't get it right now, just stick with it and it'll sink in eventually. But
Maybe.
so anyway, as far as yeah, getting into the different aspects of program funds. And basically, when you submit the budget for a grant, if it's Apex and you have a certain percentage, or it's SBDC and you have a 50% percentage, or whatever it is, then whatever you put in your budget, there's, usually personnel, fringe, travel, supplies, contracting, and that match that you put in next to what you're going to spend on the federal funds, and there's a column for in kind, that all needs to align. It basically becomes federalized. So if you, whatever you would charge to your federal money, you need to follow those same rules, follow down to the cost match. For the most part, there's been some recent changes for SBDC that has made a little thing with that about travel for conferences. But for the most part, if you wouldn't spend federal money on it, then you wouldn't spend the cost match on it and the in kind. And um,
And it's those
what
3 together that then becomes you
the
have the
total,
broader term, which is program funds, right?
yeah,
And so
yeah,
program
becomes the
funds
total.
encompasses those 3 different sources of funds, and that means then they're all subject to the same
Audit.
compliance and regulatory, requirements, right?
Hmm. Yeah,
Okay, alright.
and
I
yeah,
think that's the key point here, right? Okay.
yeah, because I think I've seen some, in doing financial reviews, and subrecipients would say, "Oh, but it wasn't federal money; it was cost match." It's like, just think of it as all the same bucket, honestly,
Right, which is
because
why we
it
call it
has to
program
be the
funds.
same rules.
Exactly, right,
Yeah.
okay, alright, alright.
So,
And are there any standards about what's allowable for match that's important to think about initially? Like I said, we're gonna get into a little bit more detail about this, but,
yeah,
kind of big picture?
I mean, it has to be in line with the program's mission. So if
Okay.
you have a women's business center, and that, you have the certain, rules in your proposal about what you're aligned with, and for SBDCs and Apex, it needs to be in alignment with that. And so one kind of um, gray area sometimes that I remember from a center that had a workforce development agency as well, um, that there were items that were like training events, for example, that were put in the cash match or even program income, which is a kind of a separate category that's also program funds. But they would be about workforce development, in my opinion. It was like serve safe or things like that. That's about restaurant workers versus entrepreneurs. So are you training the employees or the employers? Just keep in mind that, besides other things that are more outrageous, not charging alcohol or things like that. But yeah.
So in another episode, we are gonna talk a little bit more about, you mentioned program income, that as well, but just, real quickly here, just to confirm, program in or, you know, define program income and kinda yes or no, can it be used as match?
Yeah, so it depends. It depends on your grant. So
Okay.
for SBDC, it can't be used as match. Again, I'm hoping I'm not misspeaking, but I believe for WBC it can be used for match. And that it's not really something that I've encountered with Apexes or VBOC. But as far as like the official budget. Um, so yeah, it depends, but
And
for the most part, yeah, SBDCs, you wouldn't use it as match.
right, but program income comes from the grant recipient
Training
charging
revenue.
fees, right, for something? Okay,
Yeah, so
okay.
it'd be using the federal funds or the cost match or program income to pay people to do trainings. And so that's and then when you're paying those people to do well, Yeah, those trainings are happening, I guess, depending on what bucket they're being charged to. But then when a recipient, like if I'm going to go to a training and I pay $20, that's what's going to go into the program income bucket. And so then you kind of get that money from people in the community that are being trained. And then that you can use that on paying salaries or travel or whatever, but it still needs to be in the concept of being federalized, that you need to spend it on the same things you would spend the federal money on.
Right. And I guess the key takeaway for people listening to this is that whether or not you can use that as match is going to be dependent upon the parameters of the grant and the funding agency in terms of what they allow. Because certain grants allow program income to be used as match and others don't.
Yeah. And there's
Okay.
some strategies about how people, I mean, and we can get into this later too, about if people are putting certain revenue into program income versus cost match. But the minimum that needs to be recorded in the program income, it should be any fees that were charged to the community members to take a training. That's what should be in.
Yeah, that's part of programming. Okay. Like I said, we'll dive into that in more detail in another
There's
episode.
always so many more layers. Yeah.
Right, right. So at the beginning of this, when you were defining match, you gave some examples of where additional, where an entrepreneurial support organization could get some additional funds that they could be able to identify and use as match. Can you just maybe talk a little bit about what some of those, non-federal sources are?
Mhm. Yeah, so I think a lot of states get money directly from their state government, and that is great. And I lived through, in my experience with California, not having that money until I want to say like 2017, 2018. So we really had to scramble and get creative about the in-kind, making sure we were counting all the waived indirect. Getting money from local counties that, it's really about that networking and stakeholders and marketing your SBDCs at the local level so that they see the benefit of, there could be chambers of commerce, things like that, that you're partnering with to provide a lot of times trainings. And a bank, can see that, oh, wow, if people knew more about how to do their financials for a loan, that would, give us more money. So why don't we give you money to help teach them that, those kind of partnerships. Um, so in that case, and then your host is normally, hosts are supposed to put in a certain amount of money. In my experience, it's been paying for the director or something like that, a position. And they should be contributing that they actually care about the organization and understand that it helps the community. Economic development corporations. I've seen CDBG funds that you've gotten contracts with to do trainings. And then, yeah, the private partners, banks, foundations, other nonprofits.
Okay. So, I mean, going back to your original point at the beginning of this is, match is just any non-federal funds. And so really, you're only limited by your imagination, I suppose, and time in terms of, what you can pursue as non-federal funds to bring in to use as match to be able to acquire that federal grant. Right.
Yeah. And
And
I've even
well,
heard, yeah, but yeah.
oh, no, well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think one of the things that brings up is maybe if you could talk about in order to be successful in getting that funding, it seems to me that you really need to make sure that what you're doing kind of lines up with the strategic priorities of these other funders.
Yeah.
And have you seen, any examples of where that's worked well, or maybe where there's been some problems where maybe there hasn't been that kind of mission alignment?
I mean, one of the things that's been hard, I think, in my experience is tribal situations of trying to make inroads with, um, there is alignment and there are ways to do it, but it just has seemed difficult or not enough resources maybe have been spent or just different cultures. But, um, tribes do have money and they do have economic development needs. And so there could be, I think, opportunities there. And then also, yeah, just like you're saying, people need to understand locally there were some movements towards wind and some different, things that are coming into the community, and maybe not anymore, but it's just kind of knowing where we're going in your community as far as the priorities for legislators and where to kind of make a sell and make sure that the name is known out there, right? So people are like, oh, I care about small businesses. I should know about the SBDC, and I could donate to them.
Okay, good. Well, it sounds like now that you've got your federal grant, now you've got all these other, pockets of money that you've identified as match. So you've got to go back to a lot of people and tell them, what you're doing with that money. So it sounds like, the tracking and reporting of this sounds, pretty challenging. Um, can you
There's some
talk about
tricks.
any, yeah, best
Yeah.
practices maybe that you've seen to
Yes.
help make sure that you account for them appropriately. They meet federal requirements and they meet the requirements of the match source. I mean, how should if we're just getting started, what are one or two key things to think about here?
Yeah. So as far as the tracking and reporting, again, there's, I learned by trial and error, but when I first came into doing this, almost all the grants were reimbursement. And so it would mean that we'd have to submit a bill and put our general ledger behind it, make sure we charged only the things that that grant, said in it, et cetera. But if it is something that's a, a chamber of commerce that's donating money for a training, or it's something that's less city, county, um, I moved towards doing a fee for service model. And so that meant the scope of service is written up saying, we, agree to provide this many trainings or host this event with you, and you agree to pay this much for each event or this training. And so then we would print out or submit a report. I mean, it wouldn't show the client data. It would just show this many people attended the training and on this date. And so it's like, okay, yes, we did 4 trainings for $1,000, whatever, and then keep it that way so that you're just doing a program report versus like a financial auditable report all the time.
Okay, all right. Um, so I think we're going to get into this in probably more detail in the next episode. But starting out, what considerations should leaders, take in terms of determining which costs are charged to federal funds versus which are charged to match? Are there any rules of thumb or, advice that you would have?
Um, yeah, I guess I would say, well, and it also depends on the cycles of the grant, because a lot of times the
Mhm.
cycles, there's like this financial cycle versus this financial cycle versus this financial cycle. So, um, I mean, if all the grants were on a January through December basis, for example, then I would probably be trying to spend mostly salaries on the federal money. I know that's what some states like Georgia do, is they only allow people to charge salaries to the federal money. And then everything else, travel, et cetera, can go on the cost match. And again, it depends on the rules, because where I've been in California, that the federal grant has certain rules that you can spend money on, and then the state gives cost match, but they might have slightly different rules what you can spend money on. So you have to like abide by each of those rules. I mean, so anyway, but yeah, so the money needs to be in alignment with the federal grants rules, and not be breaking the rules of your cost match, who you're getting the cost match from, your funder. And then I think that's really about it, that it's, but then if you have them on different cycles, you want to make sure to spend down the money that's going to expire first. So, in my experience, that was the state money was on a federal fiscal year. So we would spend the state money first, kind of because we knew that we had a 2 year, and I think now it's a 3 year time frame to spend the SBDC money. So, depending on whatever your cycles are, but yeah, making sure to not leave money on the table, I guess.
I guess, yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I mean, the kind of the key point there is you wanna spend down your full award so that you can access a full follow-on award, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and that can be on the cost match side as well as the federal side.
Okay. Alright. Alright. Um, so, I guess one of the other things is, people listening to this are likely to come from different sized organizations, right? In terms of budgets, resources, capacity. So, this may be a big question, but how can leaders adapt their match strategy to fit their specific circumstances? For example, how does this play out when an organization, has a group of, diverse funding partners that provide match versus an organization that gets all of its match maybe from just one source?
Right.
Any recommendations on how to approach that, those types of different situations?
Yeah, I mean, if there is an area that they just are not very well funded, I mean, for example, there's a lot of rural as well as metropolitan areas in the regions I've worked in, um, and there will be kind of a match requirement that's the same for of a metropolitan area versus rural counties that like a certain percentage, for example. So they do have more of a challenge, but I think that's where, I mean, it's going to be challenging to find, clients and do outreach. It's going to be challenging to be in front of your stakeholders that have aligned missions, things like that, that you're just going to have to kind of turn over more rocks and have more connections. And it's going to be smaller buckets of money that kind of put all the pieces of the pie together. Um, and then the other thing too that could happen and to think about is if you know that a metropolitan area in your state got a whole bunch of money and maybe they can't deliver all the services or they could use some help, they could do a subcontract off of their money. So let me just say if it's San Francisco gets a contract to do some entrepreneurial work, but they need extra capacity, they could contract to a neighboring area like Marin that has less resources, and Marin could come in and do some trainings in person or remotely or things like that too. So you can think about it within your region as well as you have to get kind of creative.
Right. Well, I mean, it's kind of the advice that most entrepreneurial support organizations provide their clients in terms of their customer base and where they get their revenues. Right. You don't want to be totally dependent on just one source of revenue for your
Yeah.
organization. So, it's finding that balance between putting in the time and effort that it takes to bring in a variety of different diverse sources of non-federal funding to use as match versus, trying to pursue the big whale, right? That's going to
Yeah.
give you, $1 million or something like that. And a lot of that, you gave some good examples where it's going to be, you know, context and environmentally, specific. So if you're, maybe in a rural area, you need to pursue, a large source of funding because there's not a lot of different options. Whereas, like you said, in San Francisco, there might be you might take a strategic approach of pursuing, several smaller, partners to come on board that you identify that support as matched. So,
And
yeah,
and
it's
then there's also things, yeah, there's also just things, I mean, it's a little bit different, but strategy of if you're at the state level and you've got subrecipients. I mean, really the match is at the state level. I mean, for SBDC, WBCs are kind of standalone, it depends, but you could say, hey, these people are kind of more focusing on startups in small, distressed areas. So there's enough cost match in this other region that kind of covers some of their share. It
ah,
doesn't have to
okay.
be equal all the time.
Right, right,
If
that's a
you have
great
a
point.
region. Yeah.
Also, you in it like, using the example that you started out with, you could try to tap more, um, identify or there you can essentially fundraise in San Francisco to backfill the lack of support that exists maybe in Northern California because it's a rural area.
Which can help maybe
Okay.
more like Hmong small businesses, minority businesses, Hispanic, things like that, which benefit the whole state. And again, there's been different ways that I've seen people kind of parse it out of, there's certain types of programming that this service center focuses on, or this type of population that the service center focuses on. And so we kind of, as long as the whole organization covers their bases by the end,
Right.
yeah, it can
So
be
like an
beneficial.
example of this would be, let's say, so you mentioned Northern California. So let's say you've got a grant to serve, from the Bay Area north to Oregon, and you need, the 50% cash match. You could you could bring in some partners in the Bay Area that would invest in this project, and you could identify that money as match, and then you could use most of your federal money maybe in the northern part of the region where you don't have, so just as long as the total for the whole region equals that 100%, you have the flexibility of that. That's a great tip, I think, in terms of how to think about pursuing match. Like, so the match doesn't have to follow one for one with the federal funds in terms of where they're deployed.
Yeah, and I think that's just, again, it was when you're in a cash poor situation, which, NorCal was for a long time, and then it's less so now. And so then it's like, okay, we can think outside the box a little more, or
Mhm.
kind of think bigger. And again, even if you have enough match to cover your federal funds for whichever program, still kind of think bigger. How can you keep, growing? What do you want as your vision, just like entrepreneurs do? And then there might be that one of your sources, there's a budget cut at some level, and that source is going to go away, so that you aren't caught flat-footed or off guard if that happens. You have other sources.
Yeah. No, I think this was a good way of kind of maybe reconceptualizing or broadening the perspective on how you might be able to leverage funding in different areas to support a bigger project. So that's good, and we
Well,
can
and
get into.
there might be cutting on the federal side too. So, like maybe you need to like have extra match, but extra funds
Right,
if that
right,
happens.
right. Well, one of the things I always talk about is, I mean, match is a minimum, not a maximum, right?
Yeah.
So you want to, I think beyond even the terminology of match, in which is to identify, how much funding do you need to be able to fulfill your strategic objectives and priorities that you have, and that so that you're not limited in terms of bringing on partners who are going to invest in what it is that you're trying to do.
Yeah,
Uh,
and the more match that you bring in, right, the more federal grants you can apply for as well. So, if you have one federal grant, but you have 3 times more match than you need, then you can use that match to, well, what
exactly.
about getting another federal
Right.
grant?
Right. Right. Which, I mean, I think that that's an example of how you can, leaders can start to think about moving from match compliance to, how do you maximize obtaining additional funding for programmatic success? Any, suggestion to leave folks with before we wrap this up and head into, match 201 in a future episode?
I mean, I don't think so. I feel like we probably have confused people enough, but,
Well, it
but
is a
I just,
confusing
yeah,
topic. I mean, and
it
that's why
is.
we're trying to break it down here.
But yeah, I think basically, yeah, like you were saying, Christian, is just it's it's the match is the foundation or the bottom level, but that should just be the beginning, right? It's like seed money or something. And the
Mhm.
purpose of match, which I agree with, is the federal government is giving you money. So then does your local, county, state, can they have some skin in the game and make sure that it's a program that's supported and that is wanted, and that you're connected to the community? So ultimately it's good, um but yeah, when you're going through economic downturns and stuff, it can be like scary, or just, yeah, kind of like, oh God, I have to take care of this too. So
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, but this is probably something we should have touched on, right at the beginning. But it is kind of that, the theory behind, why grants have match requirements, and I agree with you. I think that that's a strength of this approach. So it's not a it prevents it from being a one size fits all, top down, driven from Washington type of an approach. Because by requiring you to bring in other sources of funding, you're helping to assure that the program that you have is responsive to community needs, is taking advantage
Mhm.
of community assets. And I think that that's, you know, I think if we look at it that way, we can move from seeing match as this burdensome thing that, is a roadblock to, accomplishing great things, to it's helping to assure that we are accomplishing great things because, we're really tied into the communities that we're supposed to be serving. So,
Mhm.
so I think this was a good start for, like I said, a very complicated subject. So our intention is that we're looking to do two more episodes on this, in which we're going to, if you can believe it or not, get in a little bit more technical and start to think about, some of the things that go into the nuts and bolts of managing it. And then also in the third episode, I think we're going to focus on, strategic approaches to utilizing Match to help grow your program. So, Shawn, I hope you'll come back and join us for these discussions. Thank you for being with us here today.
All right. Thank you.
And yeah, and thank you for joining us. We would appreciate it if you could do three things. One, subscribe to this podcast, TA Intel. Two, share this podcast with your colleagues. And three, leave us a comment on what you'd like us to cover in future episodes. We hope you'll join us again in other podcasts of TA Intel. And before we go, here's a quick overview of the Ascend Accreditation Accelerator, which can help you ace accreditation.
Welcome to the Ascend Accreditation Accelerator. This program is designed to help you streamline your accreditation process. The purpose of the Ascend program is to ensure you are fully prepared for accreditation. We will help you assemble the necessary documentation and understand the standards. Through Ascend, you will receive tools for development, management, and benchmarking. You will also get samples, interview exposure, and an assessment tool for your program's operations. The program includes 7 on-demand webinars detailing the Ascend model process. It also features 6 live peer learning sessions on Wednesdays. Ascend provides 3 key tools and essential resources to demonstrate meeting the standards. A key item is the Accreditation Documentation Tool. This helps manage the materials to include in the self-study. The program also includes a benchmarking tool with charts and data to compare your performance against peers. You will use the Ascend Key Components Assessment to review strategic thinking, planning, and program results for learning and improvement. You will learn from veteran SBDC leaders with real-world experience, who will share proven and tailored approaches to manage your program and achieve accreditation. Registration for the 2026 Ascend Accreditation Accelerator cohort is now open. Be sure to register before the deadline on August 7th. You can find more details and registration information at www.taadvisors.org/courses. For more information on the Ascend Accreditation Accelerator or any of our services, please contact Christian Conroy.
TA Intel is a production of TA Advisors, LLC. Copyright 2026, all rights reserved. For more information, visit taadvisors.org.